The beginning of World War II helped the United States finally overcome the Great Depression. Although the United States did not enter the war until 1941, she had been gearing up for war prior to that time through her activities in assisting Britain and the other Allies fight the war. World War II was a total war in that it affected civilians as well as the military. It involved shortages on the home front and on the battlefield, bombings in which civilians as well as the military were targeted, and propaganda campaigns. World War II can be broken down into two areas. The European theater encompassed the entire European continent, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural Mountains. It also included campaigns throughout the Mediterranean basin, including the Middle East and North Africa. The Pacific theater encompassed Eastern Asia, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and Oceania. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany at the same time that Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States. Hitler had many goals for Germany when he came into power. Among those goals was a desire to make a united Germany the strongest nation in Europe. To accomplish this goal, he believed that Germany needed to expand its borders to make room for new German settlers. To do this, he planned to conquer Poland and the Ukraine and expel the inhabitants of these nations in order to make room for German settlers. He also believed that Germany had been unfairly treated in the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 through its guilt clause, the fact that Germany was required to limit the size of its army and navy, and the reparations that were forced on the country. In 1935, Hitler formally denounced the treaty's disarmament requirement and began building up the army and air force. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland when German military forces entered the area, an act that was in direct contradiction to the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 and the Locarno treaties. Neither Britain nor France was prepared for a military response, so they did not act. He also allied himself with Benito Mussolini in Italy by signing a secret protocol aligning their foreign policies. In 1938, Hitler reunited Germany with Austria and annexed the Sudetenland as a result of the Munich Conference. Again, both Britain and France know that they are too weak to come to the aid of Czechoslovakia. At the Munich Conference, Hitler will convince British Prime Minister Chamberlain that the Sudetenland is all that he wanted and that he had no plans to annex any more of Czechoslovakia. Prime Minister Chamberlain will return to Great Britain proclaiming that he achieved peace with honor and that it was peace for the time. He is wrong. In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union will sign a non-aggression pact which will basically say that they will not attack each other. Secretly, they will also sign a protocol that divides all of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Hitler knows that his plans for Germany will not be popular with other nations. September 1st, 1939, World War II will begin when the German army invades Poland. On September 3rd, 1939, both the United Kingdom and France will declare war on Germany. In June 1940, Germany will have captured or invaded Poland, the Low Countries, which are Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and France. In August 1940, the Battle of Britain begins. The German Luftwaffe will conduct destructive air raids over the country in an attempt to demoralize the British people and make it easier for Germany to invade the island nation. October 1940, Italy will invade Greece. In February 1941, Erwin Rommel will be named to command 2 German panzer divisions in North Africa. Rommel's objective is to assist the Italians against British troops in North Africa. April 1941, Hitler meets with Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs Yosuke Matsuoka. He assures Matsuoka that Germany will support Japan if that country should go to war against the United States. In June 1941, Germany and its Axis partners invade the Soviet Union. Germany has now broken the non-aggression treaty they signed with the Soviet Union in 1939. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. December 8, 1941, the United States declares war on Germany. December 11, 1941, Germany declares war on the United States. This is a photo of Erwin Rommel. He was called the Desert Fox because of his audacious surprise attacks. In 1944, Rommel began to doubt Germany's prospects of winning the war and Hitler's capacity to face reality and make peace with the Western powers. Some of his friends approached him and suggested to him that it was his duty to take over as head of state if Hitler was overthrown. However, they did not tell Rommel that their plan was to assassinate Hitler. On July 20, 1944, an assassination attempt was made on Hitler's life. After the failed assassination attempt, Rommel's contacts with the conspirators came to light. Hitler offered Rommel an opportunity to commit suicide and avoid disgracing his family. On October 14, 1944, Rommel took poison, thus ending his life. He was later buried with full military honors. Hitler hated the Jewish people. He blamed them for Germany's defeat in World War I and believed the small Jewish population in Germany at the time of the war had stabbed Germany in the back. In other words, their supposed actions had been traitorous. As many as 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were killed during the Holocaust. However, the Nazi regime did not limit their killing to just Jews. They killed anyone they thought were inferior to Germans, such as the Romani people, the intellectually disabled, dissidents, and homosexuals between 1933 and 1945. Over 1 million children died in the Holocaust. There were 6 extermination camps built in Germany between 1933 and 1945. Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp. Over 27,000 people tried to protect others from being taken by the Nazis. These are some photos taken after the concentration camps were liberated. They show the horrors of the concentration camps. Hitler was the most influential person in the 20th century. His actions changed the course of the world. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gained a reputation as a statesman as a result of his actions during the war, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt will be made famous as a result of World War II. Churchill is credited as the one person who truly knew and understood Hitler's need for war. While tanks had been introduced during World War I, their importance to fighting a war was not understood until World War II. Each country had their own tanks. The Russians built a tank, the T-34, which is the middle picture, that was mobile in mud. Germany's tank, on the far left side of the slide, was called a Panzer or Tiger tank that had a metal track. This tank was difficult to stop. Germany would only produce about 10,000 Panzer tanks during the entire war. America's tank, the Sherman tank, which is on the far right side of the slide, could be mass-produced, and America would transport 50,000 of these tanks during the war. Between 1941 and 1942, 600,000 German soldiers died during the invasion of Russia. Prior to the invasion of the country, Hitler had issued a stand and fight order, which basically meant that there could be no retreats or desertions. During the war, the United States gained air superiority through the use of the B-17 bomber, the B-29 bomber, and the P-51 Mustang. Here we have pictures of the 3 planes mentioned on the previous slide. On the left-hand side of the slide, we have the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This plane was designed for high-altitude strategic bombing, low-altitude night incendiary bombing, and in dropping naval mines to blockade Japan. B-29s also were the planes flown to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The middle picture is the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. This plane was used mostly in the European theater of war. It was employed mainly by the U.S. Army Air Force in the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe. A P-51 Mustang is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. It was a long-range, single-seat fighter and fighter bomber. It was initially developed for the Royal Air Force. The U.S. Army Air Force used it as a bomber escort, but by 1944, most of these fighters were released from escort duty and allowed to sweep ahead of the bombers in an effort to intercept German fighters before they could reach the bomber planes. Allied bombing was successful in taking out the German railroad and highway systems, which made it more difficult to transport troops. The Allies were also successful in taking out the German fuel supply. The German war machine was made to fight on the offensive rather than the defensive. The German lightning war strategy was the method of offensive war responsible for Nazi Germany's military successes in the early years of the war. Combined forces of tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery penetrated an opponent's defenses on a narrow front, bypassing pockets of resistance and striking deep into enemy territory. Once American forces were able to put the German forces on the defensive, the war was in its final stages. Similar to World War I, World War II was a two-front war in Europe. The Eastern Front was controlled by Hitler, and the Western Front was controlled by the German army. In the end, Hitler could not and would not negotiate. He had to be in charge of everything, which meant some military decisions could not be made without his approval. In the end, Hitler felt that the German people had failed him. He wanted to punish the people for losing the war, so in the end, he ordered that everything be destroyed. Hitler ordered the German army to invade Poland in 1939, but never expected the invasion to lead to a world war. He expected Britain and France to still be so weak that they would not even attempt to go to war. He believed Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was a pacifist who would not allow his country to be drawn into a second war only a mere 20 years since the end of World War I. By 1942, Hitler's power began to erode. By that time, the United States had entered the war, and Operation Barbarossa, the surprise attack on Russia, had failed. While Hitler might not have expected the world to go to war over his invasion of Poland, he accepted the challenge with his newly built German army and air force. He planned to invade England, Operation Sea Lion, but the plan was abandoned when the Luftwaffe was unable to achieve air supremacy in the Battle of Britain. Unlike World War I, tanks were used abundantly and to great advantage during World War II. 3 tank commanders became household names during the war: George S. Patton for the Americans, Erwin Rommel for the Germans, and Bernard Law Montgomery for the British. During the war, tanks provided mobility, artillery, and shock effect. In mid-January 1945, the Soviets attacked Poland, pushing the Germans back to the Oder River in Germany and capturing East Prussia. On February 4, 1945, U.S., British, and Soviet leaders meet in Yalta. At this conference, they will come to an agreement on the post-war occupation of Germany. They will also agree upon a date when the Soviet Union will join the war against Japan. American forces will take Iwo Jima by March 1945 and Okinawa by June 1945. American bombers will destroy Japanese cities, and American submarines will cut off Japan's imports. However, the Japanese leaders will vow to fight on. The Yalta Conference would be the last conference of the Allied leaders that would include Franklin Roosevelt. With victory in Europe practically assured, the Allied leaders, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, made plans for the future. These plans included whether or not the Soviet Union would join the fight in the Pacific at the conclusion of the war in Europe. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan as long as 1. The Soviets would be granted a sphere of influence in Manchuria following Japan's surrender, 2. A share in the operations of the Manchurian railroads, and 3. Control of the Kuril Islands. These leaders also discussed the future of Germany, Eastern Europe, and the United Nations. They agreed to include France in the post-war governing of Germany, and that Germany would assume some, but not all, responsibility for reparations following the war. The Americans and British generally agreed that future governments of the Eastern European nations bordering the Soviet Union should be friendly to the Soviet regime, while the Soviets pledged to allow free elections in all territories liberated from Nazi Germany. Various other decisions were made about Poland and the United Nations. April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies in Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry S. Truman, his vice president, will immediately become president. April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini is killed by his own people. April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. May 8, 1945, Germany surrenders. The war in Europe has ended, but the war in the Pacific continues. While World War II officially began in Europe in 1939, the Pacific theater of the war took place in the Pacific Ocean, its islands, and East Asia beginning July 1937, when Japan controlled large sections of China. During this period, the Japanese also committed many war crimes against Chinese civilians. The war ended in August 1945 when the Japanese surrendered after the atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The roots of the war began in the late 19th century with China in political chaos and Japan rapidly modernizing. In September 1940, Japan, in an effort to gain even more control over China, cut China's ties with other countries by obtaining approval for military bases in French Indochina. At the time, French Indochina was controlled by Vichy France. In September 1940, Japan signed a military alliance with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. In an effort to discourage Japanese militarism, countries such as Australia, Britain, the exiled Dutch government, and the United States cut off sales of oil, iron ore, and steel to Japan as a means of denying it the raw materials it needed to continue its activities in China and French Indochina. Knowing that it could not last long without those raw materials and concerned about an economic collapse, the Japanese began planning for a war with the Western powers in April or May 1941. The Japanese attack had several major aims. First, it intended to destroy important American fleet units, thereby preventing the Pacific Fleet from interfering with the Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, and enabling Japan to conquer Southeast Asia without interference. Second, it was hoped that the attack would buy time for the Japanese to consolidate their position and increase their naval strength. Third, it was hoped that the attack would undermine American morale such that the United States government would drop its demands contrary to Japanese interest and would seek a compromise peace with the country. To implement these plans, the Japanese made a successful attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, followed up by the successful seizure of the Philippines, and then cutting lines of communication by seizing Guam and Wake Island. Next, the Japanese would attack Malaya and Hong Kong and isolate Australia and New Zealand. Here we see a photo of one of the Japanese carriers with planes loaded on deck, waiting to take off. This is a photo of Pearl Harbor as the attack began. It was taken by a Japanese pilot. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Isoroku Yamamoto, had studied in the United States between 1919 and 1921. He was the Japanese Marshal Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet during World War II. Chuichi Nagumo was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the 1st Air Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Carrier Battle Group. He carried out the attack on Pearl Harbor. He committed suicide in 1944 after the Japanese lost the Battle of Saipan. The Battle of Saipan was a turning point in the war as it became the first B-29 base in the Pacific. Here we see two photographs of the aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th was only the first of many attacks. On December 8th, the Japanese moved on to attack other areas in the Pacific. On December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. The decision by Hitler to declare war on the United States is seen as a strategic blunder on his part because it allowed the United States to enter the European war in support of the UK and the Allies without much public opposition. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, it appeared that the Japanese were going to be victorious in the Pacific. From December 1941 to June 1942, the Japanese were able to capture various Pacific islands with very little resistance. The Japanese war machine continued to roll over countries throughout December 1941 and into January and February 1942. In February 1942, the Japanese were making attacks on northern Australia. In May 1942, more than 80,000 Filipino and U.S. forces surrendered to the Japanese on Corregidor Island. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, General Douglas MacArthur had chosen Bataan and Corregidor Island as his major defense positions. By May 1942, when it became apparent that the Japanese would capture Bataan and Corregidor Island, General MacArthur relocated his headquarters to Australia. With all of these Japanese victories, the Americans began asking themselves if there was any way the Japanese could be stopped. Admiral Chester Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet 1 week after the Pearl Harbor attack. His greatest gift was his leadership ability. He restored morale to a shattered Pacific Fleet and created an aggressive team that helped the U.S. Navy win at the Battle of Midway, their turning point of the war in the Pacific. While on a boat tour of Pearl Harbor after December 7th, a young helmsman asked Admiral Nimitz his thoughts about the destruction. Nimitz replied that the Japanese had made 3 of the biggest mistakes an attack force could ever make, or God was taking care of America. In his opinion, those mistakes were 1. Attacking on Sunday morning when many crewmen were ashore on leave. 2. The Japanese never once bombed the dry docks opposite the ships. Bombing the dry docks would have meant the sunken ships would have had to be towed back to the United States mainland for repair. And 3. The Japanese never attacked the fuel storage tanks located 5 miles from the harbor. 1 attack plane could have strafed those tanks and destroyed the fuel supply. The Doolittle raid was significant in that it showed the Japanese people that they could be vulnerable to an attack on their homeland. It also gave a morale boost to the Americans. This is a photo of one of the planes launching from the USS Hornet. This mission was the only time in U.S. military history when U.S. Army Air Force bombers were launched from a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. By mid-1942, the Japanese held a vast area in the Pacific, although it lacked the aircraft carriers, aircraft, and air crews to defend it, and the freighters, tankers, and destroyers necessary to sustain it. The Allied codebreakers initially had struggled to break the Japanese code, but by April 1942, the Americans had gotten so good at breaking Japan's main operational code that they were able to intercept, decrypt, and translate parts of Japan's radio messages within hours of when they were sent. In May 1942, radio traffic indicated that the Japanese were preparing to make a major invasion, involving 4 Japanese aircraft carriers along with other ships, at a location designated with the initials AF. At Pearl Harbor, Navy codebreakers believed that AF referred to Midway Island because a Japanese airplane in March 1942 had reported weather conditions near islands he mentioned as AF, suggesting strongly that the designator referred to Midway. However, not everyone was convinced. To confirm that AF referred to Midway, Captain Joseph Rochefort and other cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor devised a ruse. Via submarine, they sent a message to the base on Midway instructing personnel there to radio Pearl Harbor that the salt water evaporators on the base had broken down. They were to make the transmission in the clear so that there would be no doubt that it could be read by Japanese codebreakers. 2 days later, a Japanese message was intercepted by the Americans that reported AF was running out of fresh drinking water. Midway was AF, and the Americans knew in advance that the Japanese were planning an attack. The Battle of Coral Sea was fought between May 4th and May 8th, 1942. The Japanese planned to invade Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, and then bomb Australia from there. The Japanese lost one carrier outright and took heavy losses to their air wing. The Americans lost the USS Lexington battleship, and the USS Yorktown battleship was seriously damaged. The result was that the battle was a draw, but two things made it important. One, it stopped the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby and a threat to Australia. And two, it was the first sea battle in history when neither opposing side's ships sighted or fixed directly upon the other. The Battle of Midway took place approximately 1 month after the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese objective in the battle was to destroy U.S. carriers. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had 4 operational fleet carriers and believed the U.S. Navy only had a maximum of 2. The USS Enterprise and the USS Hornet. By the end of the battle, the United States had lost only 1 carrier to the 4 lost by the Japanese. Admiral Yamamoto's enormous superiority in gunpowder was irrelevant, as the U.S. had air superiority at Midway. Midway was a decisive victory for the U.S. Navy and the high point in Japanese aspirations in the Pacific. Here you see a photo of one of the U.S. Navy fighters returning to its ship after the battle. Admiral William Bull Halsey was an aggressive U.S. Navy admiral who was in command at Guadalcanal and Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Guadalcanal was fought between August 7, 1942 and February 9, 1943. It was the first major land offensive by Allied forces against the Empire of Japan. The purpose of the battle was to capture the island so that bases on the island could be used to support a campaign to eventually capture or neutralize the major Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain. Beginning in late 1941 and throughout most of 1942, the Japanese were successful in all of their endeavors. However, by the latter part of 1942, they were retreating along the Kokoda Track in the highlands of New Guinea. Australian and U.S. counteroffensives culminated in the capture of the key Japanese beachhead in eastern New Guinea in early 1943. The war in the Pacific theater had both a naval aspect to it as well as the use of ground troops. The concept of island hopping meant that the Allies would attack specific islands where they could disrupt enemy supply lines and isolate thousands of Japanese. By establishing forward air bases, they extended their ability to attack deep into enemy territory and help lay the groundwork for their next hop. By using this tactic, the Allies could skip over heavily fortified islands in order to seize lightly defended locations that could support the next advance. The Battle of Saipan began in June 1944 with the landing of 128,000 Army and Marine personnel on the island. The Allied objective was the creation of airfields within B-29 range of Tokyo. The Japanese Navy was perhaps at its lowest point of the war at this time, as American destroyers had destroyed 17 of Japan's 25 submarines in the month leading up to the battle. Repeated U.S. raids had destroyed most of Japan's land-based planes. Only one American warship was slightly damaged during the battle. On October 20th, 1944, the U.S. 6th Army landed on the favorable eastern shore of Leyte, north of Mindanao. The U.S. forces were able to cut the Japanese ability to reinforce and supply Leyte. By 1945, the U.S. was conducting strategic bombing on Japan. Under the command of U.S. Army Air Force General Curtis LeMay, Japanese industrial production plunged as nearly half of the built-up areas of 64 cities were destroyed by B-29 firebombing raids. General LeMay also oversaw Operation Starvation, in which the inland waterways of Japan were extensively mined by air, which disrupted the small amount of remaining Japanese coastal sea traffic. At the Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union agreed to enter the Pacific conflict at the request of President Franklin Roosevelt. It promised to enter the war in the Pacific 90 days after the war ended in Europe. The Soviet Union launched Operation August Storm on August 9, 1945. As mentioned earlier, U.S. strategic bombing was intended to decrease Japan's industrial production. To cut off its oil imports that were essential to weapons production and weapons operations, U.S. submarines sank much of Japan's merchant fleet. They accounted for 56% of the Japanese merchantmen sunk. Most of the rest were hit by planes or were destroyed by mines. In August 1939, Alfred Einstein wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt to warn him that the Nazis were working on a new and powerful weapon, the atomic bomb. In December 1941, the U.S. government launched the Manhattan Project, the code name for a scientific and military undertaking to develop the atomic bomb. January 1943, the Los Alamos Laboratory Complex in New Mexico was established. This was the complex where the first Manhattan Project bombs were built and tested. July 1945, the first atomic bomb test is completed in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. This bomb created an enormous mushroom cloud some 40,000 feet high. The Potsdam Conference saw new Allied leaders from the United States, President Harry Truman, and Great Britain, Prime Minister Clement Attlee, and Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. At Potsdam, the Allied leaders reiterated their demand for conditional surrender by Japan. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allied leaders, except for Joseph Stalin, signed and issued the Potsdam Declaration, which threatened Japan with prompt and utter destruction if it did not immediately surrender. Japan rejected the Potsdam terms, so the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered on August 15, 1945, thus ending World War II. The U.S. plane Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The U.S. plane Bockscar dropped a second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. More than 240,000 people died as a direct result of the two bombings. The Instrument of Surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The surrender was accepted by General Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. There are two acceptable theories of winning a war. 1. To destroy the enemy army. 2. To destroy an area. During World War II, the Allied forces were able to achieve both. By the end of the war, the German war machine was completely destroyed. In regard to destroying an area, Germany was left a wasteland, and Japan was not far behind. Between December 7, 1941 and September 2, 1945, 318,000 Americans died. This is the second largest number of deaths in American wars, second only to the number of Americans that died during the U.S. Civil War. World War II was a total war, and the men and women that fought in it are known as the greatest generation. The lesson of the war and of the Holocaust would be to maintain a vigilance so that the incidents of persecution of ethnic groups or classes of people should never again happen. With the death of President Franklin Roosevelt in April 1945, Harry S. Truman became president. He had only been vice president for 82 days when President Franklin Roosevelt died. He served in World War I as an artillery officer and was the only president who served after 1897 that did not have a college degree. Upon his ascension to the presidency, Truman was quickly briefed on the Manhattan Project and authorized the use of atomic weapons against the Japanese in August 1945. He never regretted his decision. In an effort to maintain international peace, the United Nations was formed in October 1945. However, the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had already begun to deteriorate before the war's end. As soon as the hot war of World War II ended, the Cold War began. This new era would pit two superpowers against each other.